So you're somewhere along in your apologetics journey and you're researching, you're reading books, you're reading articles, maybe you're watching a lot of YouTube channels, maybe it's Inspiring Philosophy, Capturing Christianity, or some other YouTube channel, and you've gotten to the point where you have delved into maybe a few arguments, maybe you've broken out of maybe a different way of doing apologetics, maybe you've done presuppositional apologetics in the past, and now you're moving to more classical, maybe William Lane Craig style. Wherever you're at, if you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, there is a dark scheme of things that you have to break out of when it comes to modern apologetics. And I see this all the time. It's one of the things that I didn't see until after I broke out of it. I want to save you from that. The biggest thing about this is the obsession with arguments. One of the things that we have to do is we have to stop being so obsessed with arguments. And what do I mean by that? You might be asking, Tim, listen, arguments. Arguments are the backbone of philosophical discourse, any philosophical discourse. And that is very true, right? In philosophy, the weight is always put on the strongest argument. The issue with putting your weight always on the strongest argument is that when you're having worldview discussions, things take on a different tone. For example, if you were to be maybe in an academic philosophical setting where maybe you're having to present to some dissertation examiners the particular PhD thesis you're presenting on a particular topic, you're going to have to put an argument in favor of that. However, when we are having worldview discussions and we're having worldview discourse, where we're having to take a large metaphysical network and web of connected and related ideas, and we're having to have someone completely give up their metaphysical network of related and connected ideas for ours, that it's really going to look a little bit different. What modern apologetics does is it says, hey, listen, all you got to do is you have a few favorite arguments that you like. And if you just use those few favorite arguments that you like, then that's all you really need to do. And boom, 1 Peter 3:15 is being satisfied. But 1 Peter 3:15 is not being satisfied because the whole idea is having justification. The idea is that if you have justification for a particular worldview that you have, for a particular set of beliefs that you have, then what you should be able to do is put evidence out in favor of that view, and you should at least be able to elaborate on whatever that evidence is if someone is going to ask you about it. And so if you might have never heard 1 Peter 3:15 be put in an evidentialist point of view before, but that's ultimately what I have to share with you right now. The issue with apologetics starting with building arguments out for the justification of your beliefs rather than doing what I'm going to show you is you ultimately are going to really never reach the other person on the other side, right? The whole goal is in worldview discussions, more of a dialogue. It's very different than, philosophical discussions where you're maybe examining an idea. For example, in philosophy, right now, currently in metaphysics, there is trope theoretic metaphysics is growing. It's a thriving and growing place. And philosopher Joshua C. Jawadi has really directed my attention towards that. You're going to have people who are going to want to opt in for universals instead of trope theory, right? Whereas some trope theorists are going to argue on simplicity grounds, right? I'm very much on just parsimony grounds. All things being equal, we should accept trope theory because it can do the same work as universals do, and you don't actually have to give that up. Don't worry if you don't understand too much about universals or tropes, it doesn't matter. The idea is that in metaphysics discussions, there is a conversation about trade-offs. And the conversation about trade-offs means you get to a point where you have your theory, I have my theory. I have my built-out concept, you have your built-out concept. And what ends up happening is you have to come to the table and it's you here and it's me here. And we're looking at the data and we're going, listen, this is our explanatory target. To move the needle forward and to progress in this particular domain of philosophical discourse, you're going to have to show me the pro and con of your view. I'm going to have to weigh that against the pro and con of my view to move forward in this direction. And that's ultimately what it looks like. And what ends up happening is that there are key objections that people have to entertain, right, to be able to move forward. Ultimately, these would come in the form of reductios, right? Reductio ad absurdum, reducing something to absurdity. The idea is that a reductio ad absurdum can really come in two forms. It can either be in terms of a contradiction, right? So if your view entails a contradiction, then you really shouldn't hold that view because that is out of accordance with the rule of right reasoning, and therefore it is not justifiable, and therefore justified beliefs don't actually confer rationality. So if your goal is to be rational, if your goal is to find truth, then you must be justified. And a big part of that is just simply having a view be logically valid. So you don't want any entailments of contradictions. Second thing is it delivers counterintuitive results. And when philosophers talk about something delivering counterintuitive results, there is some undesirable outcome that is going to go against maybe some background intuitions that we've already would have held. And so if it does do something like that, then that is maybe a good indicator that you should do a rethink, you should do a reassessment and revise your view. And ultimately, this is what objections do. In the apologetic sense, what usual classical apologetics has you doing is it has you, hey, let me take a family of arguments called the cosmological argument. Let me choose something like the Kalam cosmological argument, and as long as I can articulate my three premises, premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2, universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. If I could articulate those three premises, defend those premises, then, hey, listen, I'm good to go, right? And if atheists disagree with me, then we're going to have to go through those premises. The problem is that it's not that simple, and it's much more convoluted than that. And anyone would know, if you've read William Craig and James Sinclair's article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, you would understand that 200-page essay, I believe it's 200 pages, it's been a little while since I've dusted off that book. Very good book, by the way. The problem is that it's 200 pages. And it's not just, hey, I'm delivering some premises and then I'm articulating them and then what do you disagree with? There's a lot of physics that needs to be understood. There's a lot of metaphysics that needs to be understood. There's some key principles that need to be understood to get the other person on the same page as you. And this is why atheist philosopher Graham Oppy says, listen, if you're talking to an atheist, they might not even agree with you on the same metaphysics that's required to get your view going in the first place. Well, what do you do when your view, particular argument, relies on a particular set of metaphysics that the other person does not share? A retort to this or a reply to this that someone can give is, well, and I've heard this before, well, my metaphysics is true. Well, of course you believe your metaphysics is true. But notice where the conversation goes. Instead of it being about an argument for God, now it's, why should I accept Neoplatonic metaphysics, for example? I'm not saying the Kalam relies on that, but I'm just using that as an example. We now have to rely on now I have to be convinced of some species of Neoplatonism to be able to move forward. This is a big problem because ultimately you're wanting to make progress in these conversations. If you're not trying to make progress in these conversations, then ultimately just be satisfied with the fact that you feel justified in your beliefs and move on. Maybe you like to read philosophy for fun, but you shouldn't be engaging these conversations unless your goal is for progress in some way to at least show, hey, maybe there's a blind spot on your view that my view solves or does not even run into in the first place. And a sign of a really, really good philosophical view is that if it's able to bypass completely what is otherwise seen as other philosophical problems, then that's a really good view. Not address those problems, but bypass them completely. I find that to be a big advantage of, for example, metaphysical idealism, that it doesn't answer the mind-body problem. What it actually does is it bypasses it completely because it does not rely on assumptions that would even give forth to a mind-body problem or the hard problem of consciousness, as it's put. And so this is a big problem. So we have to be weighing these things pro and con, but how we do that is going to rely on particular methodology. Now, I don't want to get into a particular methodology right now, right at this second, and there'll be more videos on that particular way, but I want us to at least get on the same page here, that what you fall into is, hey, if you find yourself online copying and pasting premises and then getting into conversations where you're having to address premises, that is the worst dialectic strategy you can possibly adopt. What I want to do is I want to institute what philosopher Josh Rasmussen institutes, and he calls it being put on the bridge of reason. And what is the bridge of reason? The bridge of reason is I want to get as many atheists as possible to see the validity of my view, to see the results of my view, and maybe to see the advantages that my view might have. And what I mean by advantages is advantages for the liberation of themselves in their own cognitive system. And how we do that is we don't come to the table with a set of proprietary premises that really only the people that truly adopt your worldview would already accept. That is not how you do that. And ultimately what ends up happening is that you don't reach the other side. One person delivers an argument and the person delivers an argument. And as the saying goes, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. And with that being said, what you want to do is you want to do this instead. You want to give up having just the arguments first approach. That's the first thing. You want to go up having the arguments first approach, and you want to get into what's called theory comparison, or what's called worldview comparison. And what you're doing is you have worldview, let's say you have worldview 1 and you have worldview 2. And what you're doing is you're looking at the internal logic of each worldview, because they're going to play by different rules, right? If one worldview is composed of a different set of commitments than another worldview, and what I mean by commitments is what we call epistemic commitments, meaning beliefs. The propositions that make up that worldview's content is not the content that makes up worldview 2's content. And when you are looking at it that way, then ultimately there is a systematic difference between the two of how they go about to systematize other propositions. What are these other propositions? That would be considered our body of knowledge or our body of evidence. There are two senses of the word evidence. There's evidence in favor of a hypothesis or an evidence in favor of a worldview. And then there's evidence in terms of our body of evidence, which is the relevant data or information pertaining to our investigation. Two different systematizations are at play here. And in a more coherentist system, these systems are going to have a coherence that one does not share. And so what you want to do in this particular situation is you want to be able to evaluate them on a level that transcends the worldview's own commitments. And what would that be? Well, that would be what we call in philosophy of science an operational criteria. So the second thing you want to do, first thing you want to do is give up the arguments first approach and adopt an operational criteria for assessing the merits and demerits of these worldviews. The moment you start doing that, you can break out of needing certain arguments, because the problem is that if your worldview stands or falls on whether or not the universe isn't eternal, past eternal, then the moment someone, maybe like philosopher Daniel Linford, proposes a skepticism towards an absolute beginning to our particular general relativistic space-time manifold, then if your theism, whatever worldview you may be holding, it may be very different than what we're traditionally used to, it's going to fall based on that particular data point. And you want your worldview to be independent of just a particularly packaged argument for the sake of articulating the things you already believe. The cool thing is that even if an argument, a premise in your argument that you once liked to use actually turns out to be false, that shouldn't actually affect the truth of your worldview, because you're just discovering at this point all the potential ways in which your worldview could be true. Maybe that particular species of your worldview that relied on an eternal universe, a universe with an absolute beginning, maybe that is telling you that, hey, the particular space where the universe is past eternal, maybe my worldview can still be true in the midst of that. And I just have to revise or readjust maybe some of my commitments that I once thought. That's a very fruitful approach. So get rid of the arguments first approach. Adopt a theory comparison by evaluating these worldviews via operational criteria. And what does that mean? Well, an operational criteria is going to be something like, what are the predictive successes or accuracies of this particular worldview? Does it predict accurately our explanatory target? How does it do well in its explaining? Is it parsimonious? Means can it be evaluated on simplicity grounds, right? Is it updatable? Is it flexible? Is it adaptable to new evidence? Can it actually accommodate paradigm shifts? Things like that are the things we're going to have to think about. Is it rationally coherent with respect to the rest of the hypotheses or propositions we have evidence for? And these are the questions that we start asking. And then when we start asking those questions, the moment that you will start to see your true confidence start to show within how you approach your worldview and how you approach your doubts that you may or may not have currently with respect to your worldview. And you will break out of this dark trap in apologetics, out of that scheme, and move into a more laxed, reason-full freedom approach to doing this. With that said, love you guys. See you in the next one.